As an icon of American history, George Washington is often hailed as the father of a nation and a leader who guided the United States to its independence. But unlike other leaders of his time, he is rarely praised for his brilliant battlefield maneuvers or military tactics. In fact, he lost more battles than he won. And yet he led an under-equipped and under-trained army against the most powerful empire of the time and still emerged victorious. Did his military leadership truly make the difference, or was victory inevitable because of other factors? Here we'll break down his triumphs and failures to answer the question, was George Washington truly a great general? George Washington's path to military leadership began in the contested frontier of colonial North America. The British and French were locked in a struggle for control over key regions for expansion and trade. This conflict would shape Washington's early career. Inspired by his half-brother Lawrence, Washington joined the Virginia militia and fought for the British Army at just 21 years old. His early military career was marked by two defeats, one at Fort Necessity in 1754, and the other during Braddock's failed expedition the following year. Though he did not demonstrate tactical brilliance in these battles, his bravery and resilience, particularly in rallying survivors after the death of his commander, earned him widespread recognition as a hero. Washington also gained self-confidence, leadership skills, and knowledge of British military tactics. All of this would certainly help 20 years later when he was elected as Commander-in-Chief of the American Revolutionary Army. However, it is important to note that Washington's selection as the military leader of the Revolutionary War was not solely based on his military experience. There were certainly other individuals with greater military acumen, but in Washington's case, it was argued that a Virginian was needed to secure the support of the southern colonies. Washington, the only Virginian with command experience who was fit for the field, was nominated by Samuel and John Adams. Congress unanimously approved his appointment. Today, Washington's approach to the war is often described as employing Fabian's strategy. This characterization, while partly true, oversimplifies his role in the war. Fabian's strategy refers to a form of military conflict that avoids direct large-scale battles in favor of wearing down the enemy through delay, harassment, and strategic retreats. Washington and his Continental Army were often forced to avoid direct engagement with the British, who were better equipped, better trained, and numerically superior. The vast, undeveloped terrain of the New World was particularly suited for this strategy, as it created logistical challenges for the British, who lacked reliable supply lines comparable to those in Europe. But to define Washington's strategy in such absolute terms would be a mistake. In reality, his approach was more dynamic, adapting to changing circumstances as the war progressed. In the early stages of the Revolutionary War, the Americans had little choice but to take the offensive. By definition, a revolution requires challenging the established order, which initially took the form of spontaneous reaction and later calculated intent. After being appointed Commander-in-Chief, Washington needed to capitalize on the revolution's momentum and strike before significant British reinforcements could arrive. Washington's early strategy was straightforward: attack whenever possible. His goal was to engage and defeat the British wherever they could be found. Though his forces were weak, in 1775 the British were even more vulnerable. Washington ordered an ultimately unsuccessful invasion of Canada in hope to expand the territories of a budding nation, studied propositions for raids on Nova Scotia and Florida, and organized a successful siege of Boston, the first great victory of the war. During this phase of the Revolution, Washington's approach was anything but Fabian in nature. However, the British quickly deployed significant forces to confront the Continental Army. By 1776, Washington found himself forced into a more defensive stance. Rather than seeking outright victories, his priority shifted to preserving his army and avoiding a decisive defeat. In this phase of the conflict, Washington made perhaps the greatest strategic mistake of the war: his decision to defend New York City. Influenced by political pressure and an overestimation of his untested troops, he chose to make a stand despite the city's vulnerabilities. Lacking a navy to counter the British fleet, Washington's forces were at risk of being trapped. Through the summer and fall of 1776, Washington's forces suffered a series of defeats, first on Long Island, then in Manhattan, and finally on the mainland. Outmatched by the disciplined British Army, the Continental forces retreated across the Hudson and through New Jersey to the Delaware River. The Battle of Long Island in particular demonstrated Washington's tactical shortcomings. During the battle, Washington left his flank exposed, allowing the British to execute a devastating flanking maneuver. The result was a significant loss, with 20% of the American force either killed or captured. Despite these setbacks, Washington succeeded in keeping the nucleus of his army intact. A combination of British missteps, strategic withdrawals, and especially Washington's skillful evacuation from Long Island prevented the revolution from being crushed early on. After retreating beyond the Delaware River, George Washington found his army in a dire state, demoralized, poorly equipped, and reduced in size. Despair spread among the men, but Washington maintained his resolve. He determined that in order to keep his army together, morale needed to improve. They needed a victory. This necessity led to his boldest and perhaps most famous military maneuver, the crossing of the Delaware River and the attack on Trenton. The Battle of Trenton, fought in December 1776, was a small but crucial victory for the Continental Army. On Christmas Eve, he led his troops across the icy Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on the German mercenary garrison in Trenton. The battle was brief but decisive. 2/3 of the German force was captured with minimal American losses. This victory reinvigorated the struggling Continental Army and inspired many soldiers to re-enlist, potentially saving the revolution. But although celebrated as Washington's greatest victory, his tactical approach did come under scrutiny. He often devised complex battle plans that depended on precise timing, something difficult even for well-trained troops, let alone the inexperienced and poorly equipped Continental Army. His famous crossing of the Delaware River and attack on Trenton was a prime example. He planned a three-pronged river crossing, aiming to launch a coordinated attack from multiple directions in order to trap the enemy. However, his timeline was overly ambitious, expecting the crossing and march to be executed with unrealistic precision. The icy river and severe weather made the crossing treacherous, and 2 detachments were unable to make it across, leaving Washington with only 2,400 men for the assault. But even under ideal conditions, such coordination would have been nearly impossible. The Americans were fortunate that the enemy commander, Colonel Rahl, underestimated the Continental Army and cancelled the morning patrol, giving Washington the advantage. Had the Germans been better prepared, the attack could have ended in disaster. Instead, Trenton became a crucial victory for the Americans. Although Washington never again endangered his army as he had in New York, he repeated some of his tactical mistakes the following year. In the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, he made a similar error to the one at Long Island. He failed to adequately scout the British position and allowed the British commander to outflank him, again forcing a retreat. The Battle of Germantown, fought a month after Brandywine, again exemplifies Washington's tendency for overly complex tactics. Washington tried to replicate his success at Trenton with an ambitious plan involving 4 columns attacking the British simultaneously. However, poor visibility caused by heavy fog and a lack of coordination led to confusion and friendly fire. The Americans were forced to retreat, suffering heavy losses. Washington's tactical failures did not go unnoticed by senior members of the Continental Army, which ultimately led to the Conway cabal in 1778. A failed attempt by a group of officers to replace Washington as commander-in-chief. The plot collapsed after public backlash, marking the only serious challenge to his leadership during the war. The next stage of the revolution brought another major shift in Washington's strategy. France's entry into the American Revolutionary War in 1778 fundamentally altered the conflict. Before, Washington had been forced into a defensive stance due to British naval superiority. But the arrival of a French fleet disrupted British control of the Atlantic coast. With this support, Washington could finally go on the offensive. This strategy led to the decisive victory at Yorktown in 1781. But it is important to note that for much of the war, Washington was fixated on New York, having surrendered it to the British early in the conflict. He remained determined to retake the city, believing it was crucial to the war effort. However, the French convinced Washington that a more strategic target would be Yorktown. Ultimately, the French were proven correct. Victory at Yorktown delivered a final blow to British resolve, leading to peace negotiations and paving the way for American independence. Taking everything into account, Washington was certainly not a master tactician on the level of Napoleon or Frederick the Great. His greatest successes in the war did not come from brilliant maneuvers in open battle, but rather from strategic retreats and surprise attacks that saved the American war effort. Even so, he was arguably the best possible leader for the Continental Army at the time. Washington's charisma and strength of character held the army together during its darkest moments. On multiple occasions when morale was at its lowest, he managed to rally his men and keep the flame of the revolution alive. That kind of leadership, for a freshly budding nation, was arguably even more important than tactical ability in battle. Washington's popularity stemmed from his leadership by example. He endured the same hardships as his soldiers, staying with them through brutal winters like Valley Forge. His charisma and commanding presence, amplified by his tall stature, inspired loyalty, while his strong moral character set him apart from others who sought personal gain. Unlike many generals, he respected his troops, advocating for better pay and conditions. And his ultimate act of selflessness came when he relinquished power after the war, refusing to become a ruler. George Washington was not a great general in the traditional sense of military brilliance, but his leadership and unwavering dedication to the cause make him one of the most consequential figures in American history.